This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally. Yes.
It's an absolute riot.
Woo!
And the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time.
What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out-of-touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
It's Wednesday, Addams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday, Season 2, begins August 6th, only on Netflix.
Deborah had to have surgery.
I had hip surgery in November of 2024.
Her United Healthcare nurse, Crystal, checked on her.
We do a routine call after surgery, and I could tell that she was struggling.
Deborah needed help,
My infection markers were through the roof.
and Crystal knew what to do
I called the hospital and said she's coming in.
and got Deborah the help she needed.
Crystal and United Healthcare saved my life.
Hear more stories like Deborah's at uhc.com. Benefits, features, and/or devices vary by plan area. Limitation and exclusions apply.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. It was a rough and tumble life in the early 1900s in the deeply forested Wynoochee Valley in southern Grays Harbor County. Fisheries and shipbuilding fueled that part of the world then, and of course, the lumber boom. Acres of pristine rainforest in Washington's Olympic National Forest. This bounty had driven homesteaders to the area with the promise of a better life. But boy, you'd have to work hard for it. In an unbelievably beautiful place where the landscape could be harsh and life brutal. But this wasn't the experience for John Turnow, because he never believed in conquering the land, exploiting its natural resources. He wanted to live and work within it, and in doing so, he lived in harmony, in nature, because it filled him up. But this love of the wild, this respect for nature's sake, it didn't suit his family. In the early 1900s, John Turnow could have had the world in his hands. Though at the time, even though he worked as a logger, when he wasn't in the woods, few knew just how affluent he was, given the way he lived his life. Let's just say, he didn't wear his riches on his sleeves, and the fact that he preferred the company of the wilderness to that of other people rubbed many the wrong way. When John Turnow was in a crowd, just walking through the door, he was an imposing figure at 6'4" and more than 250 pounds of solid muscle. And he had no vices. He didn't drink, smoke, gamble. But even with his impressive size and stature, he liked to make himself very small. He was the least likely to leave an impression, and that's the way he liked it. Until the unthinkable happened, and he would be pushed to the point of no return, although that's where he tried to escape to. His birth name was John Turnow, but he would become known as the Wild Man of the Wynoochee, villainous outlaw, or tragic anti-hero who just wanted to be left alone.
He was one that would shoot first and ask questions later.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 85, Wild Man of the Wynoochee. John Turnow was born in 1880, and he grew up on his family's 400-acre homestead near the Satsop River. Now, John's family was well respected in the area, but from a young age, he suffered hardships. When he was a boy, he nearly died from the measles. The doctor would say at the time, quote, "We have saved his life, but he will be deficient in body or in mind." Even before the measles, John had always been a quiet boy. However, after his illness, he would develop a lisp and became even quieter. The trees would become John's playmates.
The one thing that did happen when he had the measles was he developed a lisp. And he was very self-conscious about being around people that he didn't know. And his parents entertained quite a bit.
That's Bill Lindstrom, and he's the author of Villain or Victim, a book about John Turnow. As a teenager, John would escape to the woods for weeks at a time. Despite his parents' concerns, they let him, and he became very self-reliant. In the woods, he felt safe, protected under the towering evergreens thick with Irish green moss and sword ferns, and it's within this canopy that he would build his simple lean-to shelters, where he slept and stored a few belongings. As John grew into manhood, his survival skills flourished, but so did his reputation for being a little strange. Was that by design? Had his envious brothers pushed that narrative? Even though John had opted out of his family life, his brothers were still very jealous. They wanted to build their own fortunes, and John stood in their way. We know that John was good to his parents. Even though he was a loner, he would come out of the woods to help his dad with the logging business when he was needed, and he also brought gifts to the family in the form of venison, elk, and buffalo from his hunts. But his brothers were shocked, because even though he wasn't the firstborn son, John inherited the 400-acre family homestead, something his brothers weren't happy about. And many believe it is for that reason that they tried to get him committed to an insane asylum. These rumors were further bolstered when no one heard or saw John for more than a year. And when he did return home, there was heavy gossip all around town that he had escaped. But it was documented that John was actually working in the nearby town of Elma during that time period when he was supposedly at a sanatorium.
Some people say that he was a demented person. That was not true. They say there are stories that say that his family had kidnapped him and taken him to an insane asylum in Portland. This was absolutely not true.
After John returned home, he began to visit with his sister Minnie and her twin sons, John and Will Bauer. Minnie had actually named her firstborn son after John. John connected with his nephews by taking them out into the woods, teaching them his expert-level hunting, tracking, and shooting skills. However, this wonderful relationship would become fractured a bit. Apparently, John and Minnie's mother, Louisa, would break a hip. Now, Minnie lived near the Turnow's family homestead, and Ed, John and Minnie's brother, well, he was the only adult child still living at home with his mother. Ed would ask Minnie and her husband if their daughter Mary could come stay with them to help care for their mother during her recovery from that broken hip. They agreed. However, they weren't happy when they found out about the sleeping arrangements. Because of Louisa's injury, she slept downstairs, which meant Ed and his niece Mary slept upstairs alone. Eventually, Mary's parents wanted her to come back home, and when they insisted, she refused. A few months later, Mary would become pregnant. Her uncle Ed was the father, and he would take her to the port city of Aberdeen for an abortion. However, after the procedure, Mary died. Now, John didn't have any involvement with what happened to Mary, but when he returned home from another stint in the woods in August of 1911, there would be hell to pay. At this point, it's unclear if this is a true account of what happened or apocryphal. But apparently, John opting out from society and building wealth caused a family rift so deep that his younger brother Ed decided to shoot and kill John's 14-year-old dog named Cougar.
He had him for 14 years. He couldn't accompany him in the woods, but he was still John's dog, beloved pet and a beloved companion. But John had done some logging in nearby Elma and had come back to the homestead. When John discovered that his dog was killed, John picked up a rifle immediately and shot Ed's dog. Not Ed, Ed's dog.
Why did Ed kill John's dog?
Oh, he just said that he was useless. He was 14 years old. He's no good anymore.
Did Ed hope that in killing Cougar, that this act would finally push John over the edge, so that he would have proof to the world that John was quote-unquote insane, and therefore he could take over the family farm?
Why would the father leave everything to John?
Because John was the only one who came back to the property and helped him log. John was there even when he was working in the woods at various logging camps. He would always come home during planting time, and he would always come home during harvest time to help the family do the harvest the crops. And they had quite a nice ranch and farm in the east upper Satsa.
So would they be considered affluent in those days, considering all the property and the land and everything that they owned?
From a land standpoint, yeah, they would definitely be. I mean, somebody who owned 400 acres of property, yeah. Brother Fred, the oldest, and brother Ed, the dumbest and youngest, they kind of conspired to try and get John declared insane.
Even with Ed's reviled reputation because of what had happened to Mary, he was still able to convince the sheriff to go out into the woods to serve a warrant to take John into custody for insanity. But when the sheriff found John, he could clearly see that he was perfectly healthy in mind and body. It was obvious to him that he was just a man who was very capable to live off the land, and that's what he wanted to do. That he wasn't hurting anyone. He just wanted to be left alone. Killing John's dog was a senseless cruelty that didn't push him over the edge, just further into himself, away from his family, and into the woods. After that, John would be spotted every now and again in town, wearing dirty animal skins. His hair was a matted and tangled mess. I mean, he was living rough in the woods for weeks, months at a time. His appearance was beyond rough around the edges, even in that part of the world in those times. However, it was when he was spotted in the woods, running full speed away from loggers or hunters, it was a shocking sight, and rumors spread that John Turnow was now a gorilla-like man, a large, hairy beast who would appear out of nowhere to then disappear without a trace. It's ironic, those descriptions. The way that people described something that they couldn't understand. John wasn't a beast. He was a highly intelligent man who had developed a keen sense of the natural world, who loved living in the forest, not trying to dominate it. And he didn't always run from people. There were also stories around this time of hunters or loggers who would come into contact with John, and he didn't run away, but rather shared a campfire, a meal, conversation, and even went hunting together. Which is all to say that even before that day in September of 1911, John Turnow was a complicated and misunderstood man, that he was also the object of envy, a man who rejected money and his position in society, choosing instead to live off the land with meager possessions, when back at home, there were those who coveted what he didn't even seem to want. It's important to note that these are all plot points of a Greek tragedy. But on that day, September 3rd, 1911, there are a lot of theories about what happened, but there weren't any witnesses. The general consensus at the time was that John was out hunting. In fact, he'd shot a cow grazing near his sister Minnie's cabin, and he was dressing his kill when a bullet flew over his head. John immediately dropped his knife, picked up his rifle, aimed at the blurry figures in the distance, and fired. John walked over to where he knew he'd hit his mark, and was horrified to discover that he'd shot and killed his two nephews, Minnie's boys. 19-year-old identical twins, John and Will Bauer, were lying on the ground, dead.
He loved the boys, but he went out and he saw what had happened after the boys were shot. He went down, and as soon as he saw that the boys were shot, he was quite remorseful. One of the boys was not quite dead, but he still had a fatal wound. So I believe John put him out of his misery at that point. John then buried the boys in a very shallow grave so that they would be discovered as soon as possible by the posse. And he not only buried them in a shallow grave, but he called attention to the grave sites by piling leaves. Now, leaves don't fall in piles. Somebody has to pile leaves.
How did it come to this? How did it come to pass that John's nephews would shoot at him? And why would he shoot to kill his own nephews? This is where it gets complicated, because there are multiple theories. One, the boys intentionally tried to kill their uncle, but why? 2, they mistook their uncle for a bear hunched over the cow. 3, The boys fired a shot that hit a tree near their uncle's lean-to, not even knowing that he was in the area, and he just immediately shot back, not realizing that it was his nephews who had accidentally fired a shot into his camp.
The boys were at the bottom of a ravine, and they were shooting up at mid-ridge at a bear. They found the bear, by the way, when they went out looking for the boys. And the bear had been injured and was actually paralyzed. One of the posse members later became a victim of John. Colin McKenzie actually put them out of his misery, but they followed the bear's path through the mid-ridge, and because they could follow the bloodstains across the ridge. Just beyond that was a lean-to that they believed belonged to John. If he was in that lean-to and he was looking out, and there was a spot where you could look out and see down the ridge. The problem is that it was old growth timber at that point, and you really couldn't see. So he would see that there was movement. Well, there was not only movement, but if they were shooting and they missed the bear and the shot came up and it went behind the lean-to and into that cedar tree that the boys were shooting, he's going to immediately fire back. He was one that would shoot first and ask questions later.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
Some believe that John didn't even shoot his nephews. But again, there were no witnesses. Instead of facing what he'd done, most likely accidentally, John turned tail and ran into the Wynoochee wilderness. When the twins didn't return home, the family contacted Sheriff John McKenzie, and together they rounded up a search party, 50 men strong, to find the boys.
And they eventually found them. They actually were buried in the form of a T, which is really strange, because why would John Turnow bury them in the form of a T and kind of call attention to him? Others think that maybe it wasn't John who killed him and they were buried him in a T to draw attention to John. He wanted to make sure that people thought that he killed him. They were ambushed, which actually isn't his style, but yet, in a way, it was.
It's unclear why the sheriff decided to point the finger at their Uncle John. After all, there were no witnesses to the murders. The case seemed to hinge on forensic evidence, as it were, recovered at the scene.
Behind the lean-to that they believe was John's, there was a cedar tree, and the sheriff or posse found in the cedar tree a couple of spent shells. Now, the spent shells were from a US 30-30. Now, John shot a US 30-30. The boys also shot a US 30-30 because John gave them their guns for their 16th birthday.
A posse was rounded up as news spread of the horrific murders, and this was the beginning of the legend of the wild man of the Wynoochee, who had shot and killed his 19-year-old nephews, one of whom was his very own namesake. People from all over were outraged and ready to oil up their rifles and head out into the wilderness of the Satsop and lower regions of the Wynoochee Valley. But despite having an incredible turnout of men, they would always come back empty-handed. No one would catch sight of John, let alone capture him, dead or alive. And with each unsuccessful return to town, John's reputation as a wild man grew. How he had the instincts of animals, with the ability to hide in plain sight. But their attempts to find John were clumsy. He always knew when another posse was mounting because he read about it in the newspaper.
There were complaints about people not getting their paper. Well, all the time that the complaints would come in about people not getting their paper were the times that the posse was in the area looking for John.
So they underestimated him so completely.
Oh, absolutely. Well, not only that, but I mean, you have to be, you couldn't be a dummy and live in the woods and avoid people as long as he did. That's for sure.
John Turnow had made himself into a ghost. And over the next 19 months, no one would even catch so much as a glimpse of him. And yet he would be blamed for anything and everything that happened.
What's really amazing about this story is nobody saw John throughout that entire time. Some thought they saw John, but when the posses went to investigate, and also whatever happened at that time, if there was a house that burned, if there was a horse that was slaughtered, if there was a cow that was shot, or anything, if there was a robbery, whatever, anything that happened it was John that did it.
The fruitless searches for the wild man of the Wynoochee terrified the community. He would become the boogeyman of every child's nightmares. The cold-eyed giant constantly trolling the forest in search of fresh meat. No one felt safe. Women and children were warned to stay inside. But John wasn't a monster. He was a highly capable survivalist who they underestimated, and the fact that he'd eluded capture was no accident. He was clever. Ingenious, really. When he was selecting a campsite, he always chose a location around a body of water for a very specific reason. He knew that the men trying to catch him would have to cross a log to get close to his camp, and he used the natural world as his sentry system.
The whole Wynoochee area is resplendent with frogs of every size. And what he did was he would take frogs' legs and he would tie the legs together with elk hair. That he had shot and killed elk, but he would tie the frog's legs together, wrap those hairs around the logs, and that would still allow the frogs to swim in the water, get up on the log, to get around. They weren't injured in any way, they just couldn't go anywhere. And they would do their croaking and everything else until somebody stepped on a log. Somebody stepped on a log, the croaking would immediately stop.
There was a headline in the paper that the wild man of the Wynoochee had robbed a strongbox with $15,000, but the people who actually knew John, especially his neighbors, didn't believe the rumors. In fact, they would often leave food and other provisions outside for him.
It was $15,000 in coins was actually what the story was. Well, I've talked to coin collectors who said $15,000 in gold coins in those days would weigh about 3 tons. That wasn't possible. Second, that was never part of his MO. He never operated that way at all. In fact, people in the Matlock area would actually leave supplies for him in their yard. And John would always leave something for them. He would leave elk hides, or he would leave salmon.
A $1,000 reward, equivalent to roughly $33,000 today, was offered for the capture of John Turnow. That amount of money sent men flooding into the wilderness for the opportunity to catch that prize. And it would end in another death. On February 20th, 1912, a hunter mistook a 17-year-old boy for John Turnow and shot him dead. In March, the reward was increased from $1,000 to $2,000 after Deputy Colin McKenzie and Game Warden Al Elmer didn't return home after they had gone into the woods searching for John Turnow. A posse would be sent into the wilderness to look for McKenzie and Elmer, whose bodies would be found. Both men had been shot and killed by John Turnow. They had been found stripped of their clothing, jewelry, and weapons. The murders of these two men ratcheted up the fervor and anger to catch the wild man of the Wynoochee. but he still continued to evade capture throughout the rest of 1912. And in the spring of 1913, the reward was doubled to $4,000. On April 16th, 3 men, Deputy Giles Quimby and 2 deputized trappers, Lewis Blair and Charles Lathrop, would head into the woods with 2 bloodhounds who caught the scent of a man and brought them to the outskirts of a crude cabin in the forest. In fact, the cabin was camouflaged so well because it was completely covered in tree bark and had been built over a swamp near a tiny lake. The men believed that this rough cabin, deep in those woods, belonged to John Turnow. But they kept their distance. They could see that access to the cabin would require them traversing over a small footlog in the swamp. Deputy Quimby told his companions that he wanted to head back, that it would be safer to return with a posse. But the other 2, Blair and Lathrop, they balked. No way. They wanted to take him now because they didn't want to share the bounty. Eventually, Quimby would cave. After all, they had the drop on Turnow. He had no idea they were there. Quietly, the men signaled to go. Blair and Lathrop would take the lead. They crossed the down log in the swamp, with Quimby following behind. Stealthily, they got closer to the shelter. What they didn't know was that the wild man of the Wynoochee already knew they were there. The frogs had gone quiet. Without warning, a shot rang out, slicing through the silence and into Blair's body. He immediately dropped to the ground, dead. Out from behind a tree was the wild man of the Wynoochee. He fired into Lathrop, a fatal shot to the neck.
He allows Lathrop and Blair to get within 8 feet of him, guns them down without them having a chance of shooting at him. And Blair was killed immediately. Lathrop actually got off a couple of shots, and then his gun actually jammed, and Turnow killed him, and then Turnow took his gun.
During the gunfire, Quimby had taken cover behind a tree stump, but he knew there was no turning back. As he stared into the face of the man they'd been hunting for 19 months, he locked eyes with the wild man of the Wynoochee. He thought it was the most horrible face he had ever seen, shaggy beard and long hair, but it was the gleaming eyes, 2 murderous eyes that were filled with hatred.
He is now about 65, 75 yards behind the 2. So when he sees that the 2 had been shot and killed, he starts firing, and he fires 6 shots. The 7th shot, he sees a head kind of drop, and he waits and waits, and there's no more shooting. So he knows that he's shot Turnow. He doesn't know whether he's killed him or not, but he's also scared to death of this guy. And I'll tell you how we know all this, because he is the only eyewitness.
Quimby didn't know if he had hit John or if he was just playing dead, and he wasn't taking any chances. He immediately fled the scene, not even looking back as he made his way to the closest camp, where he telephoned the sheriff, who just happened to be his brother-in-law. The sheriff gathered another posse, and the crude cabin was so remote it would take time for them to reach it. But when they finally made their way toward the campsite, cautiously, they would find John Turnow, the wild man of the Wynoochee, leaning against a hemlock tree, his head drooped to his chest. At long last, he was dead. When they found John, he was wearing 3 sets of clothing, including the tin pants he'd taken off one of his victims. He was wearing the boots from another victim, which he improvised. The man's feet had been smaller than his, and so he'd cut holes in the toes. They saw that his feet were in bad shape and wrapped in rags. His hair was long, dirty, and matted, and they were surprised at how gaunt he'd become. Inside his cabin, they found a blanket and 2 quilts on a makeshift bed and cooking utensils. Before John Turnow's body was even brought out of the wilderness, word had already spread that the wild man had been killed, and people began to line the streets. They wanted to catch a glimpse. In fact, John's eldest brother, Fred, would travel up from Portland. He wanted to prevent the body's public display, but the demand was too strong. Not long after the wild man of the Wynoochee's remains had arrived at the morgue, around 250 people stormed the doors, demanding to see the body. The coroner was too afraid to refuse, and with the help of deputies, a single file line was formed. More than 650 people would walk by the body of John Turnow. Those deputies would have to force the crowd to keep moving and to stop those that were trying to rip off bits of his clothing, cut off locks of his hair or whiskers from his beard. Postcards had been printed that day, featuring shots of John Turnow in various death poses, photographs that had been taken of him tied to a tree with a rifle or propped up against a plank. Headlines screamed that the wild man of the Wynoochee was dead. They called him the great outlaw of Western Washington. Fred Turnow, when questioned by the press, would say, quote, "I am glad John is dead. It was the best way. Now that it is over, I would rather see him killed outright than linger in a prison cell." At the time of his death, John Turnow had $1,700 in his bank account. He owned real estate in Aberdeen and a large timber claim in Chehalis County. Deputy Giles Quimby would be proclaimed a hero for finally killing the feared wild man of the Wynoochee. He would eventually receive a third of the reward money. Lathrop and Blair's relatives received nothing. John Turnow would be buried in the family cemetery near the homestead. He is buried next to his parents and a few feet from his nephews. In April 2013, 100 years after Turnow's death, a memorial was erected at the Turnow Lake campsite to honor the 6 victims who allegedly were killed by the wild man of the Wynoochee.
It is a tragic story. It's a legend, is what it is. Interestingly, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, after John was killed, wrote an editorial that actually said that if John had been left alone, he would have been another John Muir. They believed that he was that much of a conservationist, that he loved the land that much, that he did everything he did was to preserve the land.
Up next, check out our bonus episode, which is available right now on the Wild Man of the Wynoochee. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I will discuss the case, including details that didn't make it into the episode. And by the way, if you have a minute, head on over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the show. And we'd love it if you would recommend us to a friend. It really helps. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.